Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started. Can you all hear me back there? Okay, great. Welcome to the first winter 2026 World Issues Forum. My name is John Tuxell. I'm Fairhaven faculty, and I'm teaching the World Issues class this quarter. I'd like to start by offering a land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We expressed our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways, and hope that our collective stewardship can live up to those same standards. In welcoming you here, I'd like to acknowledge that the World Issues Forum was founded I guess this is going to be about the 25th year, I believe. Founded here at Fairhaven College. It was actually founded in response to 9/11 and the sense of crisis and the sense of change we all felt at that time. And I know Shirley Osterhaus was instrumental in founding the World Issues Forum at that time. Shirley, I believe may be on the Zoom link. So I'd just like to acknowledge Shirley's work and dedication to helping create the forum that we've kept going to this day. I mention that because in putting together the speakers for today, part of the thinking there was it really feels like we're at a similar, extremely important point in time for our country. So I'm pleased to have you here today for today's talk on America's constitutional crisis with Dr. Jamie Meyerfeld, Dr. Johan Neem, and Dr. Ceci Lopez helping moderate. Before we get into the talk and introduce our speakers, I would like to acknowledge co-sponsors of the World Issues Forum this quarter, the Fairhaven College's Center for Law, Diversity, and Justice, the Foundation for Western and Alumni, the Ray Walpole Institute, the Ralph Munro Institute for Civic Education, the Department of Political Science, and the Department of History. So thank you to our sponsors. At this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Neil Amarku to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. Thanks. As Johan says, I'm Neil Amarku. I'm on the faculty, and Johan, as John said, and John and I thought that it would be great to invite Johan and Jamie here to talk, and then Ceci to talk with them. So Ceci Lopez wants to remind us all that she graduated from Fairhaven College of Interdisciplinary Studies, Western Washington University in 2008. And she wrote her interdisciplinary studies concentration in law, diversity, and public policy. So she was one of the first LDJ grads from that program, that version of our program, and she has a JD and LLM from the University of Washington Law School. And she's been teaching at Fairhaven this is your 11th year, I think. And directs our Center for Law, Diversity, and Justice and our Law, Diversity, and Justice major emphasis concentration and minor. So thank you, Ceci. We're joined today by Professor Jamie Meyerfeld. Jamie is a professor of political science at the University of Washington, where he is also a professor and chair of the Department of Law, Societies, and Justice. And he's associated with the Center for Human Rights and the Program on Ethics. Jamie Meyerfeld specializes in political theory and human rights. He gave a wonderful book talk here about his book, The Promise of Human Rights, Constitutional Government, Democratic Legitimacy, and International Law, which came out from Penn about 10 years ago. And in that book, The Promise of Human Rights, he develops an account of constitutional democracy as a cooperative project enlisting both domestic and international guardians to strengthen the protection of human rights. And as the book he wrote before that was called Suffering and Moral Responsibility. So we're delighted to welcome Jamie back to the World Issues Forum. And our other speaker who will start to open the talk with some is Professor Johan Neem from Western Washington University's Department of History. Johan is a scholar of the era of the American Revolution and the early American Republic, and also of the history of education. He is a regular public contributor in writing and speech on issues relating to history, culture, and education. He is the outgoing, I believe, editor of the Journal of the Early Republic. His most recent book is a collection of his articles on higher education called What is the Point of College? That seeks to answer that question in our quote-unquote reform-minded era. And the book he wrote before that is called Democracy, Schools, The Rise of Public Education in America, where he examines the origins and purposes of public education between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And he wrote an earlier book on nationalism in Massachusetts. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Professor Johan Neem to start this.
Well, thank you so much for having me here, for coming out, even if you were required to by your professors. And it's nice to see some of my students here and colleagues and friends. This is just a start. It's difficult to talk honestly about what's happening these days, and even more so after the killing of Renee Good by ICE last week. And particularly so because the burden of my presentation today is try to tell you why I think we are no longer living in a constitutional regime. And the implications of this claim are significant, profound, and scary. It means that we're ruled by a government of force rather than law, a government with no legitimate claim to our obedience. It means that we are no longer protected by the Constitution. We are not sliding, but are now living within an authoritarian regime, or at least living within the tension between our constitutional regime and an incipient authoritarian regime, what our founding fathers would have called tyranny. It also gives me no pleasure to say these words. I'm an immigrant, and I still remember the day in 1985 that I became a citizen alongside my parents in a San Francisco courthouse. Before the judge, we, among so many new immigrants, recited the Pledge of Allegiance. And I take that pledge very seriously. One of the most important things to me is that I am an American. And therefore, the loss of what I think was and should be is a source not just of anger, but deep and real sadness. So we Americans, we pledge our allegiance to the flag and to the republic for which it stands. That's our highest political commitment. But the republic no longer stands. Donald Trump's disregard for law and norms means that we are undergoing a coup, and our republic is quickly descending into tyranny. And my understanding of tyranny reflects my training as a scholar of early American history. I teach courses on early modern England and the American Revolution, courses that seek to understand how our founders' ideas of liberty evolved. Central to their thinking was John Locke. And both Jamie and I have our John Locke with us. In the middle of the 17th century, Locke wrote in his second treatise on government, which was intended to justify resistance to royal authority, that, quote, wherever law ends, tyranny begins. According to Locke, when a ruler demonstrates their disregard for the constitutional order, they lose legitimacy. We can treat them as we would, in his words, a thief and a robber. Even in the state of nature, before governments are established, we have the right to protect our lives, liberties, and estates. But once government is established, we rely on the rule of law to protect us. But according to Locke, and this is a somewhat long quote, so I'll try to read it clearly. But according to Locke, when whosoever in authority exceeds the power given him by the law and makes use of the force he has under his command to compass that upon the subject which the law allows not, ceases in that to be a magistrate, and acting without authority may be opposed as any other man who by force invades the right of another. Think about that. From this perspective, Donald Trump is just another highway brigand, not the President of the United States. He is a private person from whom we can and perhaps must defend ourselves. Why is this so important? It reflects what Locke, and through Locke, our founding fathers meant by liberty. Today, we often think of liberty simply as the freedom to do what we want, the freedom of choice. But to our forebears, freedom meant something different. It meant to live in a free state. It was a collective possession, liberty. In the midst of the English Civil Wars, the Republican journalist Marchmont Needham wrote that since kings are so inclinable to act according to their own wills and interests, in making, expounding, and executing of laws to the prejudice of the people's liberty and security, the only way to prevent arbitrariness is that no laws whatsoever should be made but by the people's consent and election. Those words often sound trite to us today. No taxation without representation, the consent of the people, but they were fundamental to the understanding of liberty in our tradition. To be free means to live in a state in which the people consent to their laws. And to our founders, this was a causal argument because the people's representatives safeguard their liberty from the king's ambitions and will. As the Continental Congress put it in 1774, the foundation of all free government is a right in the people to participate in their legislative council. If the people cannot consent to the rules by which they are governed, then they are subject to arbitrary power, the power of the will of another, and their person's property and liberties are rendered insecure, subject to the whim and will of the person in power. That is the opposite of liberty. A close reading of the Declaration of Independence demonstrates that if the founders were alive today, they would probably be doing all they can to remove Trump from office. We tend to focus on the Declaration's early words, the most famous lines, but the bulk of the Declaration is devoted to explaining how and why governments lose their legitimate authority. Governments, according to our founders, are not dissolved for light and transient causes, but, and these are their words, only when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them, the people, under absolute despotism. If the evidence all points in the same direction, then the people can and must act to defend their liberties. That's why the rest of the Declaration, the bulk of the text, laid out the king's long train of abuses and usurpations. They sought to demonstrate in the Declaration's words that the king sought, quote, the establishment of an absolute tyranny. And that's why the primary goal of the Declaration of Independence was to prove to a candid world that the King of Great Britain had continuously and regularly placed his will above the law by bypassing the constitutional authority of the colonial legislatures and violating English liberties. As a result, the colonists, they said, Congress, were absolved of their allegiance to him. The Declaration thus concludes, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And note that they're looking at both acts and the character of the ruler. The scale of Trump's crimes against American liberties rival those of King and Parliament in the 1770s. Trump's violations of the Constitution are too long to list here, but actually, I've been keeping track every day because I don't want us to forget. I don't want it to go down the memory hole. But among those violations are illegally suspending laws and violating court orders. He has sought to dominate the other two branches of government by encouraging extra-legal violence against legislators, judges, and their families. He has weaponized the Justice Department to go after his political enemies. He threatens the media, universities, and other civil society institutions that dare to question him. Indeed, he seeks to destroy any person or institution that poses a challenge to his will. In other words, he seeks arbitrary power. He has transported innocent people beyond seas without due process. He has used his office to enrich himself at the public's expense. Trump is seeking, through executive orders, to turn local police against their communities, and he has placed armed troops among us. Trump's power is no longer contained by law. His actions are no longer lawful. I want to note that I'm not accusing the millions of Americans who voted for Trump as necessarily seeking authoritarianism. The story of how our political system failed millions of Americans for decades is much more complicated, and there is plenty of blame to go around. Nor am I taking any positions on any of Trump's specific policies. I agree with some. I disagree with others. I'm concerned with the abuse of power that has made our Constitution no longer a governing document. For this reason, from my perspective, it doesn't matter whether one agrees with what Trump wants or does not. What matters is the fact that he is acting unlawfully. Whatever the reasons that enabled Trump's rise to power, he has violated his oath of office to the Constitution and the American people, and he is no longer a legitimate holder of his office. I want to make clear just how scary what I am saying is, and even how frightened I am to actually say it. The reality is that Trump's actions means that he's no longer a constitutional president. And if that's true, federal law, indeed the legitimacy of the entire federal government, is at stake. We are in a much deeper constitutional crisis than we often imagine. Now, for practical reasons or out of fear, most of us will continue to obey federal law. I think there's also a principled reason under some circumstances, in most circumstances, to do so, which is by demanding our rights under the Constitution and obeying the laws that are legitimate under the Constitution, we also keep that Constitution alive during this interregnum. But Trump's actions mean that, to some extent, we are no longer ethically obliged to follow federal law under Trump, which includes paying taxes. And in some case, we might be ethically obliged to resist that law because it is not law, it is force. When we do, I hope we do so peacefully and with love. But in our tradition, resistance to tyrants, even forceful resistance, is sometimes authorized. Now, many Americans worry that resisting Trump will only empower him. But not resisting makes it even easier for Trump to take away our freedom. As Congress wrote in 1775, following the outbreak of hostilities against the British, honor, justice, and humanity forbid us tamely to surrender that freedom which we received from our gallant ancestors, and which our innocent posterity have a right to receive from us. Today, future generations are counting on us to protect the Republic. Like those who sacrificed so much to secure our freedom 2.5 centuries ago, once again, we Americans must pledge our sacred honor to uphold the legacy of the Revolution and restore the Constitution and our Republic. It will not be easy, but as someone whose parents brought me here as a child to live in a free country, I cannot bear to imagine my children or any of us not being free. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I want to start by thanking Fairhaven College and the World Issues Forum for inviting me to speak with you today, to join this really great discussion. And I also want to thank Neil Amirku for being really a tremendous host. I want to say a few prefatory remarks. First, I just want to applaud and thank Johan for his remarks, which I think are profound, brilliant, significant, bold, but also true and persuasive. So he's saying some bold things, and I would encourage you to think about what he's saying and take it seriously and really absorb the message that he's sharing with all of you, and ask yourselves, do you agree? And if so, why? And what it would mean to agree, or or why you might disagree. But I for one, I'm inclined to agree. I'm going to, my remarks, I'm going to be saying often, I agree with Johan, as Johan said, because I think we are largely in sync with each other. And as Johan said, I just want to start out by acknowledging this is a very difficult time. It's a painful time. It's a scary time. It's a frightening time. I want to acknowledge that some of us are in greater jeopardy than others. Some of us, by virtue of our identities or our communities or our situation, are in greater danger, are feeling, in some cases, real fear and anguish. And so this is a time in which all of us should be reaching out to one another, listening to one another, figuring out how we can support each other in this time of crisis. Many of you, of course, are following the events in Minneapolis, including the killing of Renee Good, but the daily campaign of terror by federal agents against the people of Minneapolis, where people are being detained, kidnapped, brutalized, terrorized, humiliated, threatened, and where our government leaders now say that the federal agents carrying out these abuses have immunity. In other words, they can do whatever they want and they won't be held accountable. That should terrify you. That's the essence of tyranny. Our government has become openly tyrannical. John Locke, of course, had a lot to say about that. But no one is safe when the government says that agents wielding means of violence have immunity from any kind of accountability if for any violent or criminal acts that they perform. Almost every hour, there's a new story that's alarming. I just glanced at some headlines today. The federal government has announced it will stop processing visas from 75 countries around the world. The home of a Washington Post journalist was raided by the FBI. So the mask is falling off. More and more alarming things are happening. That's on top of very terrifying things happening around the world. The United States is not the only country dealing with tyranny. Many of us are following the events in Iran, where the government is massacring thousands of protesters. That's terrifying as well, and we should pay attention to that. And there are other places in the world where governments are unleashing unrestrained violence. So those of us paying attention to those conflicts have an eye on continuing violence in Gaza and the West Bank, in the unfolding genocide in Sudan, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to mention just a few cases. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence and the message that's sent in that document to us today. And then talk about how Trump is betraying the Declaration of Independence, and then turn to John Locke for some guidance to help us understand what it means to have a legitimate government and to help us understand the crisis that we are now facing. So the Declaration of Independence that marks the birth of the United States is an important document. I don't really think of it so much as a national symbol, but as a moral standard that's relevant to every country in the world. It's an interesting document with interesting ideas that speaks to everybody throughout the world. And there are two main claims in the Declaration of Independence. One is that we all have human rights, and governments exist to protect those human rights. And the second idea is that governments should take the form of popular government or democracy. So two ideas, human rights and democracy. And the Declaration of Independence says we need both. And both those ideas entail the other, each idea entails the other idea. And the word I use for that concept, the concept combining human rights and democracy, is constitutional democracy. So let me just read the famous opening passage of the Declaration of Independence to remind you what it says. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. And then we go on to read that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government for the sake of freedom and safety. So that's the idea of constitutional democracy, again, the idea of human rights and democracy. John Locke is a theorist that helps us understand how those two ideas go together, but it's something I would invite all of you to think about. Why, if we believe in human rights, why does that mean that we also have to believe in democracy? And if we believe in democracy, why does that mean we also have to believe in human rights? An attack on human rights is an attack on democracy. An attack on democracy is an attack on human rights. It's important, I think, not to confuse it's important not to confuse democracy with majoritarianism. Those are two very different things. Democracy doesn't mean that the majority gets to do whatever it wants. If you have if you have 3 people and 2 people decide to kill the third person for fun, that's not democracy. That's majoritarianism. Democracy presupposes legitimacy, and legitimacy presupposes some kind of minimal justice. It presupposes a commitment to equality and therefore equal universal human rights. So we are now in a situation where our president, Donald Trump, is attacking constitutional democracy. Johan has said we no longer live in a constitutional regime, and I'm inclined to agree. But certainly it's the case that constitutional democracy is under assault. So let me just go over some of the ways in which Trump has assaulted constitutional democracy. First and most brazenly, he attempted to overturn a democratic election in 2020. He lied about the results of the presidential election in 2020. Then he led a scheme to use fake electors to stay in power despite having lost the election. And he incited a mob to attack the US Capitol in order to get the Congress to adopt the fake electors and stay in power. That was just a brazen, direct assault on constitutional democracy. He's used the justice system to target his political critics and opponents. He's used the military and federal security forces to quell protests and to terrorize entire populations, often defined on ethnic grounds. He's targeting Black and brown people in Minneapolis and other cities because of their identity and national origins. He has ignored laws passed by Congress. And the example I want to use is shutting down USAID, a program created by a law passed by Congress. And Trump decided he didn't like that program, so in defiance of congressional law, he has shut it down. And this is a devastating act. There was a study out of Brown University that estimates that shutting down USAID has already caused the deaths of 600,000 people, 2/3 of them children, and is expected to cause the deaths ultimately of millions of people. Trump and his advisors have asserted a steady stream of lies and misinformation with the deliberate purpose of deceiving the public in order to keep his actions and intentions hidden. He's used openly racist hate speech against various kinds of people. He has violated human rights in brazen ways, blowing up ships in the Caribbean and Pacific Oceans and making jokes about killing innocent fishermen, sending people to be tortured in a prison in El Salvador, which involves the crimes of kidnapping as well as torture, an obvious violation of due process of law. One of a series of assaults on the rights to physical integrity and due process. He has attacked the right to freedom of speech. So let me just give one example among many, which was the federal government's arrest and attempted deportation of a graduate student named Rumeysa Ozturk because she wrote an editorial critical of Israel at Tufts University, where she was a student. He's engaged in brazen, spectacular acts of corruption. There was an article in the New Yorker by David Kirkpatrick published in August 2025 showing that in the first 8 months of the new administration, Trump had enriched himself by $3.4 billion through corrupt practices. He has openly denounced and defied international law, saying that he doesn't view himself constrained in any way by international law, and that view has been put into action through the intervention in Venezuela and threats to take over Greenland. And then finally, it is important, and Johan mentioned this as well, to pay attention to his character, his history of sexually assaulting women and joking about it, his use of lies. And he has said publicly, he has said that he lies purposefully in order to deceive people, his vindictiveness, his spite, his corruption. These are also, I consider, a threat to constitutional democracy. And as Johan correctly notes, many of these kinds of practices are specifically stated in the Declaration of Independence as the kind of acts that show you that your leader has declared himself has declared himself an enemy of your freedom and an enemy of your safety. So these are all serious things that are happening, and we should have a discussion about what we should do about all of this. Let me just turn briefly now, if I still have some time, to John Locke, and some of you have read chapter 18 in John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which is a nice encapsulation of his general theory of legitimate government. And Locke really speaks to our situation and our time. I don't think that Locke's theory is perfect. I think there are serious flaws in his argument. However, I also think that it's my personal view that the general structure of his argument is sound and important and right. And it's my view that the overall structure of his argument is correct because the underlying premises are correct, and that we can use the underlying premises to correct the flaws in his argument. And I'm happy to talk about that more later. But what Locke tells us is that we are free and equal human beings, and that because of that, we should treat each other in a certain way. We should respect each other, and we should respect each other as equal human beings with equal human rights. And the code that the term he uses for that code of action is the law of nature. But we can think of the law of nature as a rough synonym for morality or justice. And it centers the idea of human rights, including the right to life and liberty and health and possessions. The law of nature governs us in the absence of government, and the law of nature governs us under government as well. It's our constant rule. Justice, we must always follow justice, and no one may ever violate it, ordinary individuals and public officials alike. But because we are fallible and imperfect creatures, we need a little bit of help in making sure that we uphold justice. And for that reason, we create political institutions to guarantee more reliable adherence to the law of nature. And what are those institutions? Those are institutions that are founded on, the common sense observation that no one should be judged in their own case, that it's never a good idea to concentrate power in one person's hands. It's a good idea for people to monitor each other to make sure that they're not committing crimes against individuals. So politically, that means, Locke tells us, that laws should be made by collective bodies or assemblies elected by the people. Those assemblies must understand that they themselves are bound by the law of nature or basic rules of justice, and means the creation of an executive branch that faithfully follows the law. It means appointing judges to ensure that public officials follow the law. It means the separation of powers, with the legislative power supreme over the executive power. This is the best political arrangement, and deviations from this arrangement show a malevolent intent to abuse the rights of the people. So we need democracy, meaning that the people must ultimately be in charge, but we may never use that power in order to harm others. As Locke writes in a wonderful line, nobody can give more power than he has himself, which he means you can never use your power in a way that is contrary to justice. And Locke, this is my final word from my final comment, Locke is really especially useful in guiding us through this difficult situation. He reminds us to pay attention to the behavior of public officials and to notice when that behavior expresses or manifests or reveals a criminal intent to harm the people, to enslave them and hurt them. And so in a line that Johan quotes in his article, if we see a long train of actions all tending the same way, and that way is the direction of tyrannizing people, depriving them of their liberty, then we know that we are in danger and that indeed, as Johan says, we may no longer be living under a constitutional regime. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our speakers. This is incredibly enlightening and very troubling need to have this conversation. Both of you address the role of the executive. And in our Constitution, we know that power is divided in three branches of the government: the executive, well, the legislative, and the judicial. Can you address a little bit how is it that these branches have abdicated their power, or in which ways we could reignite that power to rebalance a rogue executive?
Okay, in 30 seconds. It's a really complicated question. I mean, first off, the last 20 years of Congress have seen increased polarization and gridlock. That's created a vacuum for political power that presidents of both parties have sought to use. You've seen a great increase in executive orders, for example, by presidents of both parties. At the same time, and this is a difference between the parties, is that starting in the 1980s, the Republican presidents have subscribed to, even if none of them have taken it to its extreme the way Trump has, unitary executive theory, this idea that that the executive has complete and total control over the executive branch. That's not really grounded in an honest assessment of the executive. In fact, the take care clauses and the requirement to faithfully execute the laws are closer to the kind of oath a sheriff would have taken than a king would have taken. And so there's a clear sense that the purpose of the presidency, even though it's a powerful executive, is to execute the laws. Now, what we have right now is within gridlock, you have this other theory of executive power, a very powerful state and a Supreme Court. And what you really have going on right now, I think, is the Supreme Court and the executive vying for dominance in our constitutional system. And the party and the branch that is supposed to be supreme, Congress, the legislative branch, in abeyance. And I think that has a lot to do with the gridlock and then the hyperpartisanship. And that created a space for people like Trump to come in.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So what do I think about that? I think that the U.S. Constitution is a reasonably decent document. I mean, people argue about it, about its flaws. It has flaws, but it's reasonably decent. But it's being disregarded at the moment because we have a lawless president. So we can talk about, how we could improve the institutional structure, but I don't think that's the issue. I think the problem is that we have people who have embraced lawlessness. No set of institutions, however perfect they may be, can survive a situation in which the people who are entrusted with power are devoted to acting in a lawless way. So that, I think, is the issue. And it's important to name the culprits. They are Donald Trump, and they're also the Republican Party. And I want to and just remind you, all public officials take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and many of our public officials have violated that oath. To me, there are sort of two moments that really are significant. One was, I think, on February 13th, 2021. I think I have that date correctly. And that's the date in which Republican leadership in the Senate decided it would not support the impeachment of Donald Trump after he tried to overthrow a Democratic election. And that sent a powerful message from the Republican Party. It said, we're fine if our leaders, we have no objection, we will not take action if our leaders try to overturn constitutional democracy. I think that date is a turning point in the history of this country. The second key event that I want to emphasize is the decision by the Supreme Court in a case that I think is called Trump versus the United States, in which a majority of the conservative justices, a majority of the court, ruled that the president enjoyed immunity from criminal prosecution for most of his acts while in office. That was another invitation to Donald Trump, who was at that point, running for president, to be lawless. Between the two of them, the Republican Party in Congress and the Supreme Court have played decisive roles in undermining the constitutional democracy by unleashing an unlimited and lawless executive branch.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if there were comments that you wanted to have with each other about your specific presentation. If not, we can move on to questions from the students. Have any questions, Sophia? Thank you.
Sorry, this is kind of a long one, and I have lots of citations. So a lot of the Constitution, they make sort of references to times when the executive or the legislative branch can sort of take action against threats to protect national security. And a lot of them are kind of vague. Like Article 1, Section 9 includes the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion or invasion of public safety may require it. There's Article 1, Section 10 that says no state shall, without the consent of Congress, blah, 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 engage in war unless actually invaded in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. That was challenged. I remember that was used to challenge Texas Governor Greg Abbott's use of excessive force along the border that caused the death of several migrants trying to cross the Rio Grande. And his excuse was, we are being invaded. And then that brought into a bunch of question of what does being invaded actually look like? Is this even legitimate? Sorry. as well as the fact that in Article 3, it discusses how treason in that definition, but also how life, liberty, and the pursuit of I'm going to drop that one. I forgot. I'm sorry. I'm very nervous. But yeah, there are a lot of these very vague definitions of you can suspend a lot of our liberties in the pursuit of national security. Do you think that that is what has caused a whole lot of holes to be poked through the Constitution when it comes to Donald Trump executing his will? And would it be beneficial to maybe have an amendment that defines these things? Or would that also lead into some kind of attacks against our other liberties? And yes, that is my question.
Thank you for your question. That's really great. Just a few thoughts. I do think there are serious flaws in the Constitution. There are loopholes, there are openings, it's badly drafted in certain ways. I think Article 2 is badly written. That's the article that creates the executive branch and the president. It sort of, I don't think the unitary executive theory of the Constitution is correct, even as an interpretation of the Constitution. But Article 2 could have been written in a way that more firmly prevented that. So there are features of the Constitution that place liberty, in a certain kind of jeopardy. I forget which justice said that war is the Achilles heel of the Constitution. So some of the remarks about war, some of the provisions relating to war make it too easy to erode rights and liberties. So I think that is all true. But it's a balance. I don't want to exaggerate the flaws of the Constitution. I think the Constitution is flawed on the one hand, and I also think that there are bad arguments, bad constitutional arguments that abuse the Constitution and distort or warp the Constitution, the meaning of the text, in order to justify abuses. On habeas corpus and invasion, I'm just going to use those examples. So it's true, the Constitution says habeas corpus, the habeas corpus right can be suspended. Then it, gives sort of the narrow cases in which that can happen. None of those conditions are close to being met, and yet in effect, the Trump administration is flagrantly violating that clause in violation of the Constitution. About invasion, yeah. I mean, I don't know whether that provision is a wise provision, but I think we just have to put our foot down and say, migrants crossing the border is not an invasion. Invasion means sending military troops across our border. That's not an invasion. That's a kind of metaphor parading as a factual description, and we have to say, no, you're playing with words, and this is not legitimate argument.
I'll just add one small thing, and really good question. And one of the challenges that both Locke and the framers of our Constitution grappled with is you cannot have an executive that is so constrained that they cannot exercise judgment and act, because the world is unpredictable, and you need to empower an executive to serve the public good. And so two things about the examples you raised, and there's others that we can point to in our recent past, is that one of the things authoritarians do is they abuse emergency clauses, right? And they declare states of emergency where there is none. This has happened across the world. It's happened for decades, and it's happening now, that we're calling things invasions that aren't. We are calling, we're saying that cities are, not we, Donald Trump is saying, or it's that cities are breaking down into anarchy that are not. Those kinds of things are abuses that are just dishonest, right? And no constitutional amendment, as Jamie said this earlier, no constitution can contain that kind of effort, that kind of perfidy, that kind of lies. That's why the framers always believed that you have to have rulers who are virtuous, who are ethically committed to the public good. And they understood that if you get rulers who have no commitment to that, no paper document, no institution can contain that. And we have a ruler that is completely uncommitted to the kind of character that the framers hoped for. And so The challenge is you can't contain an executive to the point where a good executive cannot act in the public interest in unpredictable cases and we have someone who's taking advantage of that, and we have to just be able to say that there is no invasion, there is no emergency, and these are abuses of power.
Clarify what habeas corpus is for some of us who might not really understand the concept.
Okay. Oh, habeas corpus. Yeah, so thanks for asking. Habeas corpus is the right of an individual to challenge their detention in court. So if you are seized by public officials and you're thrown in jail or in prison, you have the right to go to a judge and say, this is illegal. I have a right to be free. And it's a right that's many hundreds of years old. Sometimes the most important legal concepts are expressed in Latin, just so that we all understand. And so whenever you hear something in Latin, you know it's important. Habeas corpus is an example of that.
Yeah, excuse my voice. I'm a little under the weather-ish, but I guess I wanted to ask, how would you characterize the complicity in this current moment of a weak and feckless opposition party that almost refuses to either acknowledge or meet the moment appropriately when like refusing to leverage power, like the very thin margins in Congress and, state officials like those in Minneapolis right now, not like prosecuting those that are, going across, going in the streets and shooting people in broad daylight. Is that an example of like erosion of our democratic values? Thank you.
Yes, but your question's particularly about the opposition party, so you mean the Democrats. And I think the challenge there is the stakes of what Jamie and I are saying we see happening are so great because if you accept that there is no legitimate government, and that we are entered a state of anarchy or tyranny, there's no legitimate path forward. So the burden on our political leaders, which I understand and respect, is that they're trying to be practical. How do we win the next election? How do we sustain the republic? How do we check this power without causing chaos or potentially the outbreak of violence? And the challenge is, I understand that. I think they're right to do that at some level. They're also worried about losing elections, right? That some of the things that Donald Trump and the Republicans are doing is quite popular. But I think so they're taking a very practical course, and I guess in such a difficult situation, I have some grace for all parties who are trying to figure their way through this because the stakes are so high, and so, yes, do I wish sometimes the opposition would be more clear? Yes, but they don't know that they can win on that. And if they lose an election, what does that mean? And so I think that's ultimately what's in their heads.
Thanks for your question. I think I'm going to answer it a little differently. Generally, I mean, I wouldn't say that the Democratic Party is complicit in these abuses and these tyrannical actions. What we have to remember is that at the national level, the Democrats don't have power. They're a minority in the House of Representatives. They're a minority in the Senate. They don't have the White House. The Supreme Court is under the control of Republicans. They don't have power. So I don't think the problem is generally speaking, I don't think the problem is the failure of the Democratic Party to oppose the Trump administration. I think the problem is that they don't have power, and that's because not enough people voted for Democrats.
I have an additional question that comes to us online from Scott Linneman. The question is, could the pace difference between instant but unlawful executive orders and the slow response of the courts mean that the crisis status is temporary? I might add, clearly acute. There's no doubt about that, but relatively temporary.
Thank you. I love that question, and it picks up directly from something that Johan said in his article, which is, don't count on the courts to rescue us when an executive branch sets itself against constitutional democracy. Courts have limited power. They're limited in the questions they can address. They operate on a slower time schedule. So, and then I would add, and now we have, I think, justices who are complicit in this project. I don't feel much, that situation doesn't give me much hope. It doesn't make me think that this situation is likely to be temporary. It just means that, unfortunately, the executive branch has too much power and too much ability to dismantle constitutional democracy.
Just a really, thank you, Scott, for that question. Just a couple other things. First, I am worried a little bit about us relying so heavily on the Supreme Court because that itself skews our Constitution. I really worry that we're vying between Supreme Court dominance and an executive branch dominance, and both are distorting our democratic system. The pace question is really complicated because I think actually I see the Supreme Court doing the opposite through its shadow docket, which is making quick and fast decisions, but failing the democratic test of giving public reasons for what you're doing. So they're actually enabling. Will they, in the long run, decide that the damage is bad enough and step in? I don't know. But at this moment, I worry that they're actually doing the opposite, which is they're working as enablers.
I believe I heard it mentioned, I think from Professor Neem, that our abiding by the laws of the land keeps the Constitution alive, even when our government is really flagrantly kind of disobeying those laws. And I was just wondering at what point, if ever, it's our responsibility to turn to things like civil disobedience or violence or force in our protection of our personal liberties. Is it only excusable when we're first threatened ourselves, or is there nuance there?
Thanks for that question. That's a really hard question, right? And of course there's space for nuance there. What I think is that we are at a moment where civil disobedience is authorized because you have to stop a lawless government from acting lawless. So when I say we should uphold the law through our actions, it's because that law, which is no longer being protected or faithfully executed by the executive branch, is still the law that enables us to peacefully protest, right? I guess the thing that is, I think, is that it was really scary is you don't know when the point for kind of more physical or violent resistance emerges. And I would say, just practically speaking, I don't think we're there, only because we haven't seen yet the kind of mass protests that perhaps should be a precursor to that, right? That we should, I mean, Gandhi and Martin Luther King have taught us that mass protests can and work without us becoming like them, right? And so I think it's always dangerous when any person decides to engage in violence because violence has a danger of corrupting ourselves. That said, and this is why I think the example of Continental Congress really matters, is when state violence was directed against other people, the people responded well before Congress wanted them to. So in 1775, Continental Congress issues its Declaration on the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. Americans had already taken up arms. Then the leaders were behind, the opposition leaders, the patriots, were behind. And the question then we're all going to face is when that happens, when a protester is pushed too far and they respond in violence, we're going to face a very difficult decision. And that's a decision I think that's analogous to the one Congress faced when it said at this point, to give in is to deny ourselves our liberty and our dignity. And I really hope we don't get there. But I do think in our tradition, violence is authorized against tyrants. But that's never the first choice because of all the risks it brings to our own character, but also to the safety and well-being of so many people that it should be the last resort. I mean, that's just how I would understand it.
Thanks for that question, and thanks, Johan, for your answer. So I agree that this is a moment in which we should take action. People are being killed, they're being brutalized, they're being thrown in prison, they're being abused. People are dying in these concentration camps in the country. People are being ripped out of their communities. People are being sent to other countries where they are at risk of being tortured, persecuted, imprisoned, or killed. There are just horrific abuses across the board from a government that is now declaring that the people inflicting these abuses have immunity. This is an emergency. We have to take action. What does that mean? That's the hard question. I don't have an answer to it. But I do think it means things like protesting. If there's a protest, participate. Protests really matter. They have an impact. They're a way of preventing worse things from happening. I also think it's really good to join an organization that is trying to protect other people, that is trying to organize resistance. There's so much you can do as a member of an organization, a good, responsible organization that you cannot do alone. Those are just some general thoughts I have.
Sorry, to sort of, I don't mean to abuse my privilege of having the microphone. So, but I just wanted to invite us to think more about this idea that we should go on the street to sort of protest what our government is doing. We elected some people to represent us in Congress. What's their job if they cannot do that? Why should we vote for them and they have to go on the street to do all of those things which they're supposed to be doing, which we voted them for? Why should it be a responsibility? I mean, I know that we should participate in that, but why can't they be at the forefront? Why can't the excuse that they are not in government, they don't have power? I mean, when Republicans are not in power, they know how to exert influence in governance. The Democrats don't do that. Why should we excuse them? Because they don't have power.
I'll say something. Well, I mean, I do think some elected Democratic officials are participating in protests. They're doing things. They're trying to visit the detention centers. They're taking action. But if they're not, I mean, I just think there's a reason. There's a reason to protest anyway, because the government overall is committing these abuses. The Democrats, either because they don't have sufficient will or they don't have sufficient power, can't block them. That's a reason. That means we have to go out and protest. That's what I would say.
And I guess the other thing is social change doesn't happen on one axis. And I think the responsibilities of an elected office holder are distinct from the responsibilities of a citizen in the streets. This is not a time of normal politics. So I think that's going back to the prior question, this is what makes these all very fraught, scary, and frightening. But if our elected office holders don't carry on and keep the government carrying on, they're putting other things at risk, including, for example, the stability of the global economy, right? And so they're they're struggling with a set of issues. The people on the streets can give them confidence and energy to be more aggressive in resistance. But I think social change happens at all kinds of different levers, and it's when they line up towards an end. But we don't actually expect every person in every position to be taking the same kinds of actions.
Also, just one more thing about protests. I mean, there can be good reasons not to participate in protests if you think it's not safe for you to do so because of your citizenship status or for reasons of health. So I'm not saying that everybody must do it. I want to acknowledge that our circumstances vary, and there may be cases in which you have valid reasons for not doing, for personal reasons for not participating.
Hi. So I feel that we're reaching a climax in political tensions and general dissatisfaction. I hear from some people thinking that after Trump's presidency, there's going to be a really far swing to the left, whereas I hear from others that trust in the system is going to be so corroded that there's going to be a radical restructuring. I know this is sort of a difficult, if not impossible question, but I was wondering what do you predict will happen next?
So one of the things that makes historians is the idea of contingency, which is that the past only looks logical and fixed from the perspective of those who are living well beyond that time. But at the time, we have no idea what the future will bring. And I think this is really important because if the world is contingent, there are multiple possibilities out there. We could descend into a soft authoritarian state, right? We could have an election that leads to the restoration and renormalization of a prior regime. This could be a moment of radical rethinking and transformation that emerges with 10 years from now, we could see a different and better and more beautiful democracy. We don't know, but what that means is because history is contingent, because the future is always dependent on so many factors that are not known until people study them later on, we have power because people make the other thing that historians believe is that people have agency. And so I can't predict the future, but the future can be shaped by us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have no idea what's going to happen. But, and I agree with Johan, what happens will depend on what we do. So yeah, this is a moment where, people need to think. This is a moment where everybody needs to sort of think like, what's going on and what am I going to do? This is one of those moments.
Hello. So it's been proven that nonviolent resistance is twice as likely to succeed in regime change. But it's also been said by people like Fred Hampton that it only works if that society has a moral conscience. Trump recently said his only limit is his morality. Do you think the US currently has a moral conscience? And if not, how do we start to build one?
My answer is yes. I think the US has a moral conscience. I think the vast majority of Americans are good, ethical people who don't want to harm other people. I think that because we are so polarized, not just in terms of the narratives we're inhabiting about what is causing the world and who our enemies are, and because those of technology and news media sustaining and fostering their narratives and irresponsible leaders like Trump tapping into those fears and anxieties to further reinforce our divisions, it's harder for us to recognize the suffering and struggles of others. But I think we do have a moral conscience. I think most Americans at some point will see that they don't actually want to live in a kind of society where people are angry and hate each other, where violence is on the streets, where the state cannot be trusted, where they might have to turn against their neighbors. They don't want that. So I have hope that peaceful mass protest over time will work. But I think there are some particular challenges of our moment that are going to make that very difficult. But I don't believe, I don't know what Trump's moral code is. I'm not confident in his moral code, but I do believe that most Americans ultimately are good people. And the question is how to remind them that that's who they want to be.
A slightly different answer. For me, the verdict isn't in. I would like the American people to prove to me that they have a conscience. And I would like them to do a somewhat better job of persuading me. And but that's a great question, and I like the way you framed it. But one huge problem is the power of right-wing media to feed large parts of our population false narratives about what's happening. That's an important force that inhibits the development of a conscience based on an accurate understanding of reality.
I was wondering if you guys had an opinion on the recent Supreme Court Trump v. Illinois about the deployment of the National Guard, where actually 2 or 3 of the conservative justices, voted to put some limits on that. I was wondering if you see that as kind of a tell on how they might rule in the future.
I haven't followed that closely. I haven't read the opinion, so my general thought is no, I'm not about to become very hopeful. That's fortunate, but I'm not yet ready to say that the Supreme Court will now have a change of heart, and it's done so much huge damage that I'm not hopeful in that regard.
Yeah, I think I'd second that. I mean, I think it is hopeful that the Supreme Court has seen at least some things are beyond reality and they have to step in. But I think it's also important to recognize that some of these cases are actually the Supreme Court deciding that it has jurisdiction over things that truly should belong to the executive. And in normal circumstances, we would leave to the discretion of the executive, like what constitutes an emergency that requires the use of the National Guard. So once again, we see the Supreme Court also seeking power by claiming jurisdiction. And I'm grateful that they did in this case, but it's part of a larger set of issues that are more complicated too.
Yeah, it was a little bit before I had a question. I think we were talking about our place as a general population. Do you think that there's certain people that have a larger role to play in trying to get our democracy back to a place that gives everyone equal liberties? I know there's some vulnerable people like myself who can't go to protests or advocate or do activism because of our identities. Is there a certain population that should be acting on our behalf? And what can the others do that can't participate in these things do to help out others?
I mean, I think the answer is yes. I think I would frame it slightly differently. I think I take your point and Jamie's point that not everyone can feel safe at this moment being in public protesting. Rather than, and I think people should protest on behalf of others who are suffering. But I also think we should protest on behalf of why that suffering is of concern to all of us. And that really this is about building solidarity. We're not just protesting on behalf of others. We're protesting because that harm to others is a harm to the collective body politic. And so anybody should have a stake in that. The other thing I'd say is that some people have more power because there are people who have larger platforms. And one of the things I think a lot of people I talk to feel is they would do more if they had opportunities, if they knew what to do, if there was any chance to do something. And so I think those who are social organizers, who are politicians, who are celebrities or whatever, but people who have some kind of social power have a responsibility to create opportunities for people to take action, because otherwise there's a huge collective action problem about what do we do. And so I think, but then we have a responsibility to follow through. When the knock comes on our door, we have to be listening for it, I think.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for your question. Yeah, those who can protest should protest, partly for the sake of those who would like to protest and can't protest.
The last question.
So earlier on, you mentioned different organizations that you could join and whatnot. Do you have a suggestion of where to find some of those organizations that could be supportive of speaking up on these behalfs? And do you think that participation in local government and meeting with your legislatives could be more of a benefit of achieving autonomy and agency?
All right. So I'll start with the latter point. Yeah, I do think communicating with your elected officials is a really important and valuable thing to do. So at the local and state and national levels, call them, write to them, send them emails, visit them with friends. I think that's very significant. So I'm in favor of that. In terms of specific organizations to support, which ones? I do think, groups like Indivisible, that's a partisan organization. That's it, and it's good. I think it's a good time to work with immigrant organizations that need all the help they can get. ACLU, labor unions that are good labor unions that are working on these issues. A variety of organizations that represent and defend and help vulnerable communities. I'm going to turn it over to Johan for more ideas.
Well, I think I do think meeting with local state elected leaders is very important and good, but I'm not going to name any organizations, partly because the organizations I'd name would reflect my politics. And I think that the resistance we need is going to require a very diverse group of Americans. And I think the way I would move forward is I talk to people I trust. I talk to people that we go to school with, people that we go to church with, people that we interact with, people that we hang out at the coffee shop with, people that we have some relationship with. And the politics may be very different. I mean, the reasons to oppose this regime is because we believe in living in a constitutional republic, not because we believe in higher or lower taxes, and not because we believe in the Republican or Democratic Party platforms, not because we're on the left or the right. So my naming organizations would name ones that would reflect what my particular politics is in that. I think talk to the people you trust and are involved and see what organizations they're using to help save our country, and then try to build bridges with other organizations that may actually have different politics, but are ultimately trying to do that good work.
Okay, we've reached just about the end of our time. I would just quickly add, for those of you here in Bellingham, there was a protest last weekend, was organized primarily by Indivisible Bellingham. So that is an organization that's working in the community, led in the community, that has for many folks in the community has been an important way of organizing to push back, especially, and the focus of the protests this past weekend was specifically in response to Renee Good's killing. So there are regular protests against the ICE facility in Ferndale. So there are opportunities right here in town to if you are comfortable protesting, if you feel that fits how you personally want to push back, there are those opportunities on a regular basis. So I think that message of find ways to get involved is the key one here. So we've reached the end of our allotted World Issues time. I'd like to thank our speakers and our moderator, and thank you all for coming. And we will have another speaker next Wednesday. We're going to be welcoming the Honorable Raquel Montoya Lewis, one of our Washington State Supreme Court justices, is going to join us for the forum next Wednesday. So thank you again for joining us.